The morning sun rose slowly over Andrews Air Force Base, stretching long shadows across the tarmac. The air was brisk, carrying the familiar mix of jet fuel and dew, a scent that seemed permanently etched into the concrete of America's most guarded runways. The day appeared ordinary. Mechanics tightened bolts, crew chiefs shouted checklists, and engines roared to life in the distance as steel birds prepared for the day's flights. Yet for those who paid attention, there was something different about this morning, an almost imperceptible hum of anticipation, a rhythm just beneath the surface that suggested something more. At one corner of the runway, a military transport aircraft waited, its nose pointed toward the endless sky. It wasn't the kind of plane that turned heads functional, reliable, more known for hauling equipment and personnel than carrying VIPs. Soldiers and staff filed up the stairs, some clutching folders, others lugging gear. They carried themselves with the casual confidence of people accustomed to the routine. The chatter was low, the mood professional. To the untrained eye, it was nothing more than another mission in the long grind of military schedules. Among them, however, moved a woman who did not immediately draw attention. She was dressed in a plain gray suit, her shoes practical, her bag modest. No polished entourage trailed behind her, no aides carrying documents or phones. She blended into the stream of passengers with ease, stepping lightly up the stairs, pausing only to exchange a polite nod with the airman at the door. She carried a small leather-bound notebook, tucked neatly under one arm, her only visible possession besides her travel bag. To anyone watching casually, she could have been a mid-level bureaucrat, perhaps an analyst or liaison tagging along for a briefing. She chose a seat by the window halfway down the cabin, sliding into the cushion with practiced ease. Her movements were efficient, economical, as though she had traveled this way countless times. She set the notebook on her lap, opened it with care, and began writing with a simple black pen. Her handwriting was steady, deliberate, the strokes of someone accustomed to focus. Around her, officers strapped in, buckling their harnesses, trading murmured words about weather conditions, projected flight times, and destinations. No one paid her more than a passing glance. Yet there was something about her presence, something that resisted invisibility, even though she seemed intent on it. A flight attendant noticed it first. As she passed down the aisle, collecting small items and ensuring safety checks were completed, she caught herself lowering her voice near the woman's row. It wasn't out of fear, nor deference consciously given, but something instinctive, like stepping carefully into a sacred space. Others felt it too. The air seemed quieter around her, her calm composure drawing invisible lines of respect. Still, no one spoke her name, and no one asked questions. Outside the cabin, the scene told another story entirely. At the far end of the runway, 2 F-35 fighter jets were being prepped with unusual urgency. Their engines, sleek and predatory, growled as ground crews completed final checks. Pilots strode across the tarmac in flight suits, helmets tucked under their arms, their faces set in stone. Orders had been delivered hours earlier. Stand by for escort, maintain readiness at all costs. No details beyond that. In the world of military aviation, secrecy was routine, but the clipped tone of the briefing left no doubt this wasn't standard procedure. Captain Marcus Rhodes, lead pilot for the mission, adjusted his gloves as he climbed the ladder into his jet. The morning light caught the sharp lines of the aircraft's nose, the cutting-edge fighter glistening like a blade. He strapped in, every movement precise, ritualistic. Years of training had conditioned him to prepare without hesitation, but today felt different. He didn't know the passenger's name, only the importance attached to her presence. Protect the transport at all costs, the briefing officer had repeated, his eyes narrowing as if to drive the words deeper. Rhodes didn't need further explanation. In his world, orders like that carried their own weight. Back inside the transport, The engines rumbled, vibrations running up through the floorboards as the aircraft came alive. Passengers shifted in their seats, fastening belts, some dozing already, others reviewing documents. The woman by the window remained serene, pen gliding steadily across the page. Occasionally, she paused to glance out at the horizon, where clouds drifted lazily, unaware of the forces gathering below. She seemed untouched by the noise and motion around her, as though she carried a stillness within her that insulated her from distraction. As the transport taxied toward the runway, the two F-35s came to life. Engines roared, flames spitting from exhausts as the jets rolled into position. The ground crew signaled final clearances, saluting sharply before stepping back. The pilots' helmets lowered into place, visors reflecting the bright morning sun. In the silence of their cockpits, they exchanged a brief, not unspoken words of discipline and trust. This wasn't simply about flying. This was about sending a message without ever speaking it. From her window, the woman couldn't see the fighters yet, but she knew. She always knew. Years in her position had taught her that silence often carried the loudest signals. While others looked for fanfare or announcement, she understood the true markers of significance, the quiet shift of protocol, the subtle tightening of security, the way a base seemed to breathe differently when her presence was accounted for. She closed her notebook for a moment, resting it gently on her lap, and allowed herself the faintest of smiles. Around her, the cabin continued its rhythm. Officers laughed quietly at a shared joke. A staffer leafed through a thick folder. Someone yawned and adjusted a seatbelt. To them, this was routine. To her, it was ritual. Every journey carried meaning, every flight woven into the larger fabric of responsibility she bore. Today was no different. She carried decisions that would ripple outward, decisions that touched defense budgets, global strategies, alliances, and the lives of countless men and women in uniform. The transport might look ordinary, but its passenger was anything but. The engines surged, pressing everyone back against their seats as the aircraft lifted from the ground. The earth fell away beneath them, replaced by endless blue. For a few minutes, the climb seemed unremarkable, another ascent into familiar skies. Yet far below, the two F-35s had already left the runway, climbing rapidly, engines screaming with power. They cut through the air like arrows, banking smoothly into formation. Within moments, they would rise to join the transport, their presence invisible for now, but inevitable. Back in the cabin, the woman resumed writing, her pen scratching softly against the paper. She wrote not as someone journaling thoughts, but as someone organizing a battlefield of ideas, aligning strategies with precision. Every word mattered, every note a building block, in decisions that could not afford mistakes. Around her, others might still see just another passenger, quiet and unassuming. But outside, in the rising roar of twin fighter jets, the truth was already being written in the sky. She was not just another passenger. She was the reason warriors snapped to attention, why machines of war roared into life, and why silence carried weight heavier than words. And though the passengers did not yet realize it, they were about to witness a reminder. Even the quietest figure on a flight can carry the weight of a nation. The transport aircraft rolled forward with steady force, engines humming with a rhythm that filled the cabin. Passengers leaned back as the floor vibrated beneath them, the weight of acceleration pushing them gently into their seats. The woman in the gray suit sat by the window, her notebook open, her pen tracing deliberate lines across the page. She appeared as if she'd made this journey countless times, unaffected by the rising roar outside. To her left, two uniformed officers debated a point from their briefing packets. Their voices were hushed, but she ignored them entirely, immersed in her writing. As the wheels lifted off the ground, the cabin dipped slightly, then steadied. Through the windows, the runway shrank into a thin gray line, replaced by a quilt of green fields and suburban rooftops. The sky stretched wide and clear, bathed in the pale light of early morning. The transition was seamless for the passengers, many of whom had flown this route before. To them, it was another flight, another chapter in the steady rhythm of service. But beneath the ordinary veneer, layers of unseen choreography were already unfolding. Up front, the crew ran through their post-takeoff checks. Voices crackled over intercoms, each report confirming systems green, altitude climbing, airspeed steady. The captain of the transport gave a brief glance at the passenger manifest clipped beside him. His eyes lingered for a second longer on one name, though he said nothing. He was a professional, trained to carry all ranks and statuses without hesitation. Still, he knew this flight was not like the others. His instructions had been precise. His crew briefed quietly. Discretion first, vigilance always. Whatever else came, the passenger in row 14 was no ordinary traveler. Outside, the airfield shrank to a cluster of hangars and runways. Rising from its edges, the F-35s had already begun their climb. Their engines flared with precision, leaving shimmering heat trails in their wake. Captain Rhodes steadied his jet, eyes flicking across instruments, confirming altitude, fuel levels, radar sweeps. His wingman, Lieutenant Vega, held formation just off his right side. They spoke sparingly, exchanging clipped confirmations through secure channels. Their mission didn't need elaboration. Escort flights were familiar, but today's escort carried unspoken weight. Rhodes knew it. Vega knew it. The silence between their words said more than chatter ever could. Back in the transport, the passengers adjusted to the rhythm of flight. A young lieutenant leaned his head back, closing his eyes against the hum of engines. Across the aisle, a staffer flipped through pages of intelligence summaries, highlighting sections with a yellow marker. Near the front, a colonel pulled out a pair of reading glasses, adjusting them as he studied a thick folder balanced on his knees. All of them carried responsibilities, decisions, burdens of their own. Yet none matched the gravity of the woman who sat quietly by the window, her notebook a world unto itself. She paused occasionally, glancing through the oval glass at the horizon. The sky was still empty, nothing but soft streaks of clouds. To anyone else, the view was calm, peaceful. But she knew better. She knew the choreography of these flights, the invisible layers of protection that encased them. Even if the passengers could not see the fighters yet, she could feel their presence anticipated, inevitable. They were already climbing, aligning, preparing to slide into position like silent guardians. She closed her notebook momentarily, resting her pen on its spine, and folded her hands. Her face betrayed nothing, but her mind ticked forward like a clock. Meanwhile, Rhodes and Vega edged higher, leveling into altitude bands that paralleled the transport's climb. They would not be visible, yet not to the passengers, not to the naked eye from those oval windows. But they were there, tracking, calibrating, preparing to lock into their protective corridor. Rhodes felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders. Missions like this demanded more than skill. They demanded clarity, patience, and vigilance that bordered on obsession. Every sweep of his radar, every glint on the horizon had to be accounted for. The woman inside the transport didn't know his name, but Rhodes knew hers carried a weight greater than most ever would. The cabin crew made their first pass down the aisle, checking belts, offering water, collecting stray items. Their smiles were professional calm, but even they sensed the difference in atmosphere. Subtle, but present. They noticed how the woman's seat seemed to radiate quiet gravity. Passengers instinctively kept voices low near her row. A young staffer, who had almost stumbled against her seat, quickly muttered an apology, only to find himself lowering his tone further than expected. She looked up briefly, offered a polite nod, then returned to her notebook. That small exchange was enough to silence him for the remainder of the flight. At the back of the cabin, whispers had begun. One officer, peering out the window, muttered to another, "Think we'll get an escort today?" The other shrugged. "Probably not. They don't roll those out unless someone important's on board." The first laughed, dismissing the thought, but his eyes darted back toward row 14, where the woman wrote steadily, unbothered. Neither man realized how close their guests would come. In the cockpit of the transport, a soft chime sounded. The co-pilot glanced at the radar display, catching the signals before confirming with a quick nod to the captain. "They're in the air," he said. The captain gave a simple acknowledgement, eyes still forward. It wasn't his job to explain to the passengers what would happen next. That responsibility belonged to the fighters, whose presence would soon announce itself in thunder rather than words. Outside, Rhodes adjusted his altitude, narrowing the gap. His jet sliced through a thin layer of clouds, the sun catching the fuselage in a sudden gleam. Vega mirrored the move seamlessly, their formation tight, deliberate. They were ghosts on the horizon, still out of sight of the transport's passengers, but closing the distance. Rhodes inhaled slowly, steadying his nerves. It wasn't fear that sat in his chest, it was awareness. Awareness that the woman inside the transport carried influence capable of shifting policy, strategy, even war. He wasn't protecting one person. He was protecting what she represented. Inside the transport, the atmosphere remained deceptively calm. The officers returned to their folders. The lieutenant drifted toward sleep. The staffer highlighted another page, his marker squeaking softly. And the woman continued writing, her pen scratching out lines of thought that would later become decisions, directives, instructions carrying the weight of command. For now, though, she remained just another passenger quiet, unnoticed by most, her significance hidden in plain sight. But outside, the F-35S streaked closer, ready to reveal the truth that no one in the cabin yet realized. The flight had only begun, but the tone was already shifting. What had started as a routine journey was about to transform into something far greater. The transport had been airborne for nearly half an hour, gliding smoothly through calm skies. The steady drone of the engines lulled some passengers into silence, while others fell into casual conversation. Officers compared notes on their assignments. Staffers shuffled through thick folders of reports, and a few leaned back, eyes closed, trying to steal a moment of rest before the day ahead. Nothing about the cabin suggested anything out of the ordinary. It was the usual rhythm of a military transport flight, predictable, routine, almost dull in its steadiness. Then, without warning, the atmosphere shifted. It started as a faint tremor, a vibration that wasn't in sync with the steady hum of the transport's engines. At first, no one paid attention. A passenger thought it was turbulence. Another brushed it off as his imagination. But then the sound deepened, a rolling growl, low and powerful, unlike the steady rhythm of the aircraft they sat in. It was sharper, more aggressive, carrying a resonance that rattled faintly against the cabin walls. Heads turned. Conversations broke off mid-sentence. People began pressing palms against the windows, squinting into the bright sky beyond. "What's that?" someone whispered. The first glimpse came suddenly, a flash of sunlight bouncing off something metallic, far too sleek to be mistaken for another transport. A few gasps followed as the shape grew clearer. The cutting-edge silhouette of an F-35 Lightning II fighter jet, wings glistening in the sun. The jet swept into view with lethal elegance, sliding into position alongside the transport like a shark gliding beside a ship. Its canopy caught the light, revealing the vague outline of a helmeted pilot inside. A ripple of shock spread through the cabin. "Are we being intercepted?" one man muttered, panic rising in his voice. Another passenger leaned forward, pressing his forehead to the glass. That's not random. Look at the way it's flying. That's an escort. Before anyone could process the words, a second F-35 appeared on the opposite side of the transport, perfectly mirroring the first. The pair flew in flawless formation, their noses angled just enough to show dominance, their wings slicing through the air with unnerving precision. The rumble of their engines filled the air around the transport, a reminder of the raw power riding just meters away. Inside the cabin, anxiety spread. Officers exchanged uneasy glances. Staffers whispered hurried questions. One passenger reached for a phone before remembering no signal would reach this altitude. The sense of unease was palpable, the air growing thicker with each passing second. But there was one person who did not flinch. The woman in the gray suit sat calmly in her seat, her notebook open across her lap. She did not look out the window, though she could certainly hear the roar beyond it. Her pen moved with unbroken rhythm, words flowing steadily across the page. Around her, passengers craned their necks, wide-eyed and muttering, but she continued as if nothing had changed. Her calmness was more unnerving than the fighters themselves. It didn't take long for whispers to turn into theories. "They don't scramble jets for no reason," an officer said quietly. "There has to be a threat nearby. Then why are they flying so close? That's not defensive, it's protective. Protective." The word hung in the air. It lingered in the thoughts of those who heard it, sinking in slowly. These jets weren't circling randomly, nor were they intercepting a foreign aircraft. They were here for a reason, and that reason was inside the transport. Another glance at the woman in row 14 told them all they needed to know. The fighter jet's arrival shifted the very energy of the flight. Every small sound in the cabin seat belts clicking, pages turning, pens tapping now, felt amplified under the hum of the engines outside. Passengers tried to continue their routines, but their eyes kept drifting toward the windows, then toward her. The realization crept in like a cold wind. She was not just another passenger. Outside, the F-35 pilots held their formation with surgical precision. Captain Rhodes kept his breathing steady inside his helmet, eyes locked forward. His wingman Via mirrored every movement, their jets slicing through the air as one. To them, the mission was clear. Guard the transport, shield the passenger, and signal to any who might be watching that this was no ordinary flight. They were both acutely aware of how their presence must appear from the cabin loud, intimidating, undeniable. That was the point. For Rhodes, there was no room for hesitation. Every radar sweep was analyzed, every potential blip studied. His eyes darted between instruments and the transport, ensuring nothing drifted too close. Missions like this were not about action, but about deterrence. Their very presence was meant to prevent a threat before it even arose. Inside the transport, however, deterrence felt like intimidation. Passengers whispered furiously, their words weaving theories into the charged air. One staffer clutched her folder tighter, knuckles white. A lieutenant tapped his foot rapidly, betraying the nervous energy he tried to mask. Even the crew sensed it, their calm professionalism carrying an edge of stiffness now. The woman, however, remained composed, turning a page in her notebook, pen gliding smoothly. To those who watched her, it became increasingly clear. She knew exactly why the fighters were there. "Who is she?" someone finally breathed. The question carried through the rows like a spark. People didn't answer, but their eyes followed the same path to row 14, to the gray suit, to the calm figure who rode steadily as the roar of F-35s filled the sky. Slowly, the truth began to dawn on them. She wasn't just another passenger. The escort wasn't for the officers, the staffers, or the colonel buried in his folders. It was for her. The fighters outside had not appeared because of a threat. They had appeared because of her presence. And with that realization came a new tension. It wasn't fear of the fighters now, but awe. Awe of the woman who could command such silent, overwhelming protection simply by boarding a flight. The atmosphere settled into a fragile balance. Whispers quieted. Restless fidgeting slowed. Passengers stole glances at her, but no one dared approach. Her silence commanded more authority than a speech ever could. The notebook on her lap seemed suddenly heavier, as though every word she wrote carried the weight of strategy, policy, or decisions that might shape nations. Outside, the fighters remained steady, their presence a constant reminder. They were more than machines. They were guardians, symbols of discipline and loyalty, shadows that told the world, this person matters. And inside the cabin, the passengers finally understood what the pilots already knew. She was no ordinary traveler. She was the reason warriors snapped to attention, the reason engines roared to life before dawn, and the reason two of America's most advanced fighters cut through the sky like blades beside her. The first signs had appeared, and they had changed everything. The steady hum of the engines filled the cabin, but it no longer carried the same comfort it had at takeoff. The presence of the fighter jets outside had changed everything. Their thunder rolled through the fuselage, a constant reminder that this was no ordinary flight. Passengers shifted in their seats, some craning necks to see out the oval windows, others whispering in low, urgent tones. What began as speculation quickly became a storm of questions. "Why are they so close?" muttered one officer, pressing his face against the glass. "They're not patrolling. They're sticking right with us." Across the aisle, a young staffer clutched her folder against her chest. "Do you think we're in danger?" she asked in a shaky voice. "Maybe they picked up something on radar." Another passenger leaned over, shaking his head. "That's not a defensive move. That's protective. Look at the way they're flying tight, locked in. That's escort protocol." The word escort carried weight, and those who heard it fell silent for a moment. In military flights, escorts weren't routine. They were deliberate, rare, and always for someone who mattered. Eyes turned discreetly, one by one, toward the woman in the gray suit. She sat exactly where she had from the beginning, calm, steady, her notebook open across her lap. Her pen moved with quiet rhythm, the scratch of ink against paper somehow audible to those nearest her. She hadn't looked up once since the fighters appeared, hadn't flinched, hadn't betrayed even the smallest sign of surprise. If anything, her composure was more striking than the roar outside. Passengers noticed. They whispered to each other, carefully timed glances confirming what words struggled to articulate. Something about her presence, so understated, yet so commanding, seemed suddenly undeniable. "Who is she?" one man whispered. The question rippled across rows. No one answered at first. Then, as if scripted, a flight attendant approached her row. She bent down slightly, speaking in a voice so soft it was almost lost beneath the engines. Yet those close enough caught the faint address. One word, one title, and it was enough. The air seemed to freeze around them. Passengers stiffened in their seats. The title echoed in their minds, fitting together with the puzzle of the F-35s outside, the quiet gravity of her presence, and the unspoken instructions of the crew. The whispers multiplied instantly. "That's her?" someone murmured. "It has to be. That explains everything. The fighters aren't here for us. They're here for her." Recognition dawned slowly, like a curtain lifting to reveal a stage that had been there all along. The atmosphere of uncertainty transformed into something sharper in awe, tempered by nervous respect. Every passenger in that cabin now knew they weren't simply sharing a flight with a fellow traveler. They were sharing it with a figure of enormous significance, someone whose very presence demanded invisible walls of protection. The officers who had been muttering about escorts now sat straighter in their seats. The staffer clutching her folder relaxed her grip, as though reassured by the realization. The colonel near the front adjusted his glasses, giving the woman a long, studied look before returning silently to his papers. No one spoke directly to her, yet their behavior shifted instantly. The cabin, once alive with whispers, settled into a hushed reverence. The woman, for her part, remained untouched by the stir she had caused. She wrote steadily, pausing only to glance briefly at the margin of her notes before continuing. If she heard the whispers, she gave no sign. Her stillness carried more authority than any confirmation could have. She did not need to assert herself. Her identity had already done it for her. Meanwhile, outside, the F-35s flew with unbroken focus. Captain Rhodes adjusted his altitude slightly, the maneuver mirrored perfectly by his wingman, Vega. Their jets carved through the sky with surgical precision, never straying more than a few dozen yards from the transport. To the passengers inside, they looked like shadows stitched into the horizon, unyielding, protective, ever-present. Rhodes' thoughts, however, were entirely on his instruments, his eyes darting between radar sweeps and the shimmering landscape ahead. He knew the woman's role, at least in part. He didn't know her personally, but he knew her importance. His mission was clear: ensure her safety, whatever the cost. Inside the cabin, the tension shifted again. What began as anxiety had morphed into recognition, and now into something resembling pride. To be on this flight meant proximity to power, to decision-making, to history in motion. Passengers found themselves sitting taller, adjusting uniforms, softening their voices. Even those who had been skeptical moments earlier now carried expressions of quiet respect. The reality had settled firmly in their minds. They weren't on an ordinary mission, and they weren't sitting beside an ordinary passenger. One officer leaned toward another and whispered, "We'll be telling this story for years." The other nodded, eyes still locked on the window where the F-35 glided effortlessly alongside. "Yeah, this isn't the kind of flight you forget." The woman closed her notebook with deliberate care, slipping the pen neatly into its spine. She rested it on her lap, folding her hands atop the leather cover. For the first time, she glanced out the window, her gaze falling directly on the fighter jet beyond the glass. The sight did not startle her. Instead, she held it with calm certainty, as though looking into a mirror that reflected not herself, but the weight of the office she carried. Around her, passengers fell even quieter, sensing the gravity of that small gesture. Without saying a word, she had acknowledged the fighters, acknowledged the mission, and acknowledged the silent pact between those inside the cabin and those flying in the sky beside them. She was the reason the pilots had snapped to attention. She was the reason the engines roared with such ferocity outside. And she was the reason the whispers in the cabin had transformed into reverent silence. The transport pressed steadily onward, its path invisible against the vast canvas of blue. The roar of the fighters continued outside, unwavering, unrelenting. Inside, the passengers sat with a new understanding of the journey they were on. It was no longer just a flight. It was an escort into history. The cockpit of an F-35 is a place where silence and noise coexist. The hum of electronics, the steady stream of comms chatter, the rhythmic beeping of systems checking themselves, all of it created an atmosphere both mechanical and alive. Yet inside that chaos, the mind of Captain Aaron Rhodes was still. His focus narrowed to the horizon, the glowing screens, and the transport plane they shadowed. He had flown countless missions before, logged hundreds of hours in this aircraft. He had chased mock enemies, pierced through storms, and skimmed over seas that shimmered like mirrors. But this mission was different. This one was personal, not because he knew the passenger in that transport personally, but because he understood what she represented. She wasn't just a passenger. She was a cornerstone of command, a voice that shaped the future of the very branch to which he had given his life. Her safety was not an assignment. It was an obligation. He shifted slightly in his seat, gloved fingers brushing the throttle. His eyes never left the glowing HUD in front of him. Numbers scrolled. Altitude steady. Airspeed constant. The transport ahead cut smoothly through the sky, a silent giant flanked by his wingman and himself. Vega, status? Rhodes said calmly into his mic. Systems green. Position locked, came the reply. Lieutenant Marcus Vega's voice was steady, professional, but Rhodes knew him well enough to sense the undercurrent. Vega felt the weight too. Their formation was razor sharp. Every angle, every movement mattered. One stray adjustment, one lapse in focus, and the escort could appear sloppy. Sloppy was unacceptable. Not today. Rhodes exhaled slowly, adjusting trim. The HUD reflected faintly against his visor, a neon halo across his vision. He thought briefly of the countless briefings he had attended, the rehearsals drilled into muscle memory. Every scenario had been tested: hostile interception, sudden radar anomalies, mechanical failures. His responsibility was not just to react, but to anticipate. That anticipation consumed him now. His eyes flicked to the radar sweep, then back to the horizon. A distant signal flashed briefly before fading, civilian traffic well below their altitude, harmless. Still, he logged it, tracking with subconscious precision. Anything that entered their airspace was his to assess. Inside the transport, he imagined the atmosphere, passengers murmuring, guessing, perhaps staring at the fighters with unease. Rhodes didn't envy them. They were in the presence of someone who could not be named openly, someone whose protection demanded secrecy. And secrecy always bred speculation. Yet the truth was simple. The secretary was on board. Rhodes hadn't met her. He had seen photographs, read briefings, absorbed her decisions rippling through the chain of command. But now, flying within arm's reach of the aircraft that carried her, he felt a connection stronger than recognition. It was respect born of trust, the military trusting him with their most vital asset. His grip on the stick tightened unconsciously. Eyes sharp. Vega, he reminded. Copy, Vega answered. His jet mirrored Rhodes perfectly, wings cutting through sunlight like blades. The two pilots were more than colleagues. They were extensions of each other in the sky. Years of formation flying had built a bond beyond words. When Rhodes tilted a fraction of a degree, Vega followed. When Vega corrected altitude by 10 feet, Rhodes anticipated the movement. Their synchronization wasn't coincidence. It was discipline forged under pressure, an unspoken promise that one would never let the other falter. Now that discipline was their shield. Minutes stretched like hours. The horizon unfolded endlessly ahead. Rhodes scanned constantly, eyes flicking between instruments and sky. He knew danger rarely announced itself. It came in silence, in shadows on the radar, in sudden blips that turned into threats. He could not afford even a second of distraction. Yet despite the intensity, he felt a strange calm. This was why he had trained. This was why he had endured sleepless nights, brutal exercises, and the suffocating pressure of flight school. To be here, at this moment, was the culmination of every sacrifice. His thoughts drifted briefly to his father, a veteran who had once told him, "The measure of a soldier isn't what he does when the world watches. It's what he does when no one knows." No cameras watched Rhodes now. No headlines would carry his name. If he succeeded, the flight would pass unnoticed in public record, as though it had never happened. And yet, within that anonymity, he felt the deepest pride. Altitude steady, course aligned, Vega reported again. Rhodes nodded, though the gesture was unseen. Maintain. This is where we prove ourselves. Outside, the sky was a vast ocean of blue, scattered with white clouds drifting like islands. The transport moved like a leviathan, steady and powerful, while the F-35s cut sharp silhouettes against the light. To the casual eye, they were just jets keeping pace. To Rhodes and Vega, they were guardians. Inside the transport, whispers surely continued, passengers piecing together who their quiet companion was. Rhodes didn't need to hear them to know the pattern. Confusion first, suspicion second, recognition last. He imagined their faces, the sudden hush when realization struck, the straightening of postures, the reverent silence that followed. He respected that, but it didn't alter his mission. His duty wasn't to the passengers' perceptions. It was to the one life that anchored all their whispers. Time passed in measured increments, 15 minutes, then 30, then 45. Each moment demanded the same vigilance as the last. Fatigue tried to creep into Rhodes' shoulders, but he shook it off. Discipline was endurance. At one point, Vega broke the silence. Funny, isn't it? How quiet these flights can feel when you know everything depends on them. Rhodes allowed himself the smallest smile. Quiet is good. Quiet means we're doing our job. And they were. Every second the transport cut forward, without incident, was proof of their success. They weren't chasing glory. They were preserving normalcy, ensuring history unfolded without interruption. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in sharp gold, Rhodes felt a surge of resolve. Whatever shadows lingered on radar, whatever threats hid beyond the horizon, he and Vega would meet them head-on. Their formation was more than precision. It was a promise etched in steel and discipline. The secretary might never know their names. The passengers might never see their faces. But none of that mattered. Their duty was not recognition. Their duty was protection. And they would hold that duty until the very last second of the flight. The cabin had grown quieter with every passing mile. The earlier whispers, frantic and uncertain, now carried a different tone. They were slower, more deliberate, and edged with awe. One realization, once spoken, had spread like wildfire through the rows. The woman was not just another traveler. She was the traveler, the secretary herself. At first, it was disbelief. A young officer, no more than 24, had been the first to whisper the word. "That's the secretary." He said it almost apologetically, as though afraid the very air might contradict him. His seatmate had blinked at him, stunned. "The secretary? Are you sure?" But the more they thought back, the clearer it became. The unannounced boarding, the lack of visible entourage, the effortless authority in her stillness, and most of all, the F-35s that had snapped into position like knights beside a queen. One by one, heads turned subtly in her direction. Eyes lingered for a moment, careful not to stare openly. It was like watching a portrait come into focus, each passenger realizing they had overlooked the truth sitting just feet away. Near the rear, a colonel leaned back in his seat, lips pressing into a thin line. He had seen her once before at a briefing, standing at a podium while senior officers hung on her words. Even then, her voice had carried quiet command, unembellished but firm. Now, here she was, silent in a gray suit, writing in a notebook as though the fate of nations wasn't bound to her presence. The staffer with the folder hugged it tighter to her chest, her expression a mixture of nerves and admiration. She whispered to the person beside her, "I thought she would travel with motorcades, press, dozens of aides. But she's just here." Her neighbor nodded slowly. "That's how the powerful ones move. No spectacle, just gravity." The cabin's energy shifted. Where there had been unease, there was now reverence. Passengers adjusted their postures, smoothing uniforms, straightening ties. Even the casual chatter died down, replaced by an almost ceremonial silence. It wasn't forced, it was instinctual, as though everyone suddenly understood they were part of something greater. The woman herself remained unchanged. Her pen scratched softly, ink flowing into neat lines across the page. She paused only occasionally, tilting her head as if weighing her own words before committing them. To those watching, it was mesmerizing. Every flick of her pen, every subtle movement carried weight. At one point, a flight attendant approached to check on her. Their exchange was brief, conducted in whispers, but the attendant's respectful bow of the head spoke volumes. Others noticed. Confirmation, again, of who she was. By now, there was no denying it. She was the Secretary of Defense, and she was traveling among them with the composure of someone who didn't need acknowledgement. She didn't seek recognition. She carried it effortlessly, like an invisible mantle draped across her shoulders. The murmurs became reflective. "I never thought I'd be in the same room with her," one officer said quietly, almost to himself. "We're not in a room," another corrected, glancing at the narrow walls of the transport. "We're in the same sky." That distinction mattered. The presence of the secretary aboard turned the flight into something historical, even if no record would ever highlight it. The stories would live only in the passengers' memories, recounted years later to colleagues, families, and maybe grandchildren. "I flew beside her once. I saw the fighters outside, and I knew who she was." The atmosphere in the cabin grew heavier, but not oppressive. It was reverence, not fear. Passengers respected the gravity of the moment. They adjusted naturally, voices lowered, movement softened, laughter extinguished. It was as though the entire group collectively agreed to match her composure. The young officer who had first whispered her identity sat frozen, hardly daring to move. He stared at the notebook in her lap, wondering what she was writing. He imagined policies, strategies, the kind of words that could ripple through the armed forces and shift the very course of history. And she wrote them as casually as one might jot a grocery list. But that was power, wasn't it? Not loud, not flamboyant, quiet, steady, measured. The colonel near the front cleared his throat, pulling his shoulders back. He glanced once more at her, then faced forward, eyes sharp. To him, her presence was a reminder not of fear, but of duty. If she was calm, so would he be. If she traveled in silence, so would he. Meanwhile, outside, the F-35s held their formation, slicing through the atmosphere with mathematical precision. The passengers inside couldn't hear the conversations between Rhodes and Vega, couldn't feel the constant vigilance that shaped their every movement. But they didn't need to. The fighter's presence was enough. They were living proof that the woman inside was guarded by the sharpest blades in the nation's arsenal. Back in the cabin, time seemed to slow. Minutes dragged into longer stretches, yet no one seemed restless. The silence became companionable, almost sacred. They were sharing something rare, proximity to power that didn't need to shout to be felt. The secretary finally set down her pen. She closed the notebook with deliberate care, aligning the spine perfectly before resting her hands atop it. For the first time, she glanced around the cabin. Her eyes didn't linger long on anyone, yet each person who met her gaze felt a jolt of recognition. It wasn't intimidation, it was affirmation, a silent acknowledgement that she saw them, that their presence mattered too. She gave the faintest nod, not theatrical, not staged, just a quiet gesture that carried more meaning than words could. In that moment, the passengers understood something profound. Authority was not always about commanding rooms or dominating conversations. Sometimes, authority was about restraint. Sometimes it was about riding in silence, sitting calmly as fighter jets carved paths of protection outside. Sometimes it was about letting others whisper, wonder, and then realize the truth themselves. The secretary leaned back in her seat, her gaze drifting once again to the window. The F-35 shimmered in sunlight, its canopy glinting like polished steel. She watched it for a moment, not with surprise, but with recognition. The jet was not just a machine. It was a promise one forged in discipline, sacrifice, and vigilance. Around her, passengers sat straighter still, their whispers silenced now into collective respect. The recognition had spread completely. No doubt remained. She wasn't just another passenger. She was the reason the fighters snapped to attention. She was the reason silence had overtaken the cabin. And she was the embodiment of the quiet, unshakable force that defined the nation's defense. The transport moved steadily through the sky, cutting across miles of clouds and sunlight. From inside the cabin, the flight felt deceptively calm. The engines hummed a constant, comforting rhythm, and the air conditioning kept the temperature balanced. Passengers adjusted in their seats, some reading, others gazing out the windows. Yet beneath the veneer of routine, tension lingered like a current, subtle but unrelenting. Outside, 2 F-35s held their positions with unwavering precision. Captain Rhodes and Lieutenant Vega flew like extensions of each other, wings synchronized, engines roaring in controlled harmony. They had maintained this formation for nearly an hour now, eyes scanning, radar sweeping, every possible angle accounted for. The slightest miscalculation could break the illusion of invincibility, and neither pilot allowed such a slip. Inside the transport, the passengers were slowly coming to terms with the reality of their flight. The secretary's calm demeanor had spread through the cabin like a contagion of composure. Her notebook remained open, the pen moving across the page in deliberate, quiet strokes. The words were invisible to everyone else, but the weight of her presence carried through the room. Whispers had long since faded. In their place was a reflective silence, punctuated occasionally by the shuffle of a folder, the soft tap of a pen, or the subtle shift of someone adjusting a seatbelt. No one spoke unless necessary, as though speaking aloud might disrupt the gravity of the moment. Rhodes' perspective from above was different. Through the canopy of his jet, the world seemed endless, an ocean of blue interrupted by the jagged shapes of clouds and the distant horizon. Every detail mattered, the angle of the sun, the glint of distant aircraft, the subtle variations in air pressure. His hands hovered over the controls with a careful precision, adjusting gently to maintain the perfect escort formation. Vega mirrored every movement flawlessly. They had flown countless missions together, but this one carried an unspoken intensity. Unlike training exercises or routine patrols, the stakes here were personal in the sense of duty. Their passenger, though invisible to them in this moment, represented an axis of decision-making and strategy whose influence was enormous. Their vigilance was not just professional, it was sacred. Back in the cabin, the passengers began to observe the subtle details that had been invisible at first. One officer leaned toward the window and watched the first F-35 glide in formation with the transport. The wings shimmered in the sunlight, the canopy reflecting the sky like polished glass. Another passenger squinted, realizing the jet's movements were not random. They responded instantly to any shift in the transport's altitude or course. They were shadowing them, anticipating, reacting before it was necessary. The realization deepened the passenger's awe. This was not spectacle. This was control, mastery, discipline. Each pilot embodied the precision of countless hours of training, the culmination of strategy, skill, and unwavering attention. They were unseen guardians, and their presence was absolute. The secretary's eyes occasionally flicked toward the windows, her gaze calm and analytical. She did not need to speak to communicate authority. Her awareness, her composure, and the subtle acknowledgement of the fighter jets outside were enough to command respect from everyone in the cabin. Her quiet presence carried power. Hours passed, marked not by turbulence or announcement, but by the smooth rhythm of flight. The passengers settled into the silence, a mixture of reflection and restrained excitement. They watched the sky, the clouds, and occasionally each other, sensing that they were part of a moment that few would ever witness again. The young lieutenant who had first whispered her identity leaned back and allowed himself a small exhale. "It's surreal," he murmured to no one in particular. "To think that she's just here among us, and those fighters, those jets are flying like shadows beside us." The officer seated next to him nodded. "It's quiet power," he said softly. "You don't need spectacle when presence is enough." The secretary paused, pen lifted in mid-air. She glanced at the lieutenant for just a fraction of a second. Her eyes were steady, assessing, acknowledging, but not interrogating. That small moment passed, and she returned to her notes. Yet for him, it left an impression deeper than words could convey. Authority, calm, and confidence without arrogance. Outside, Rhodes and Vega adjusted positions slightly, weaving through invisible air currents, maintaining the perfect shield around the transport. Their training allowed them to anticipate one another, predict the transport's subtle shifts, and respond instantly. They had learned to operate almost as one entity, a single mind split across two bodies. Every second mattered. Every movement carried weight. Their focus was absolute. Inside, the cabin's atmosphere was reflective. Passengers recognized the extraordinary nature of the journey. It was not just a flight. It was a live demonstration of discipline, coordination, and the silent power of authority. Their thoughts drifted between admiration and unease, understanding and awe. They were witnesses to something rare, the quiet intersection of human control and technological precision. Hours continued to pass. The sun arced across the sky, painting the clouds in gold and silver, shifting shadows across the cabin walls. Passengers shifted occasionally, trying to stay comfortable, yet no one complained. The hum of the transport was constant, a steady heartbeat beneath the rumble of the F-35s outside. Every vibration, every subtle shift reminded them of the unseen presence that enveloped the aircraft. Even the crew, trained for composure under all circumstances, maintained a heightened awareness. Every movement was measured, every glance deliberate. They were in the presence of both authority and power, the secretary inside and the pilots outside. The combination created a kind of energy that could be felt without being touched, a hum that vibrated through the bones more than the ears. The secretary finally set her pen down, closing the notebook with precision. She rested her hands atop it, fingers interlaced. Her eyes drifted to the windows, observing the shadow of a fighter jet against the clouds. She made no gestures beyond that, yet the subtle acknowledgement seemed to ripple through the cabin. Passengers straightened, backs stiffening, as if she had subtly commanded them to do so. Time moved forward, yet it felt suspended. The rhythm of the flight, the discipline of the pilots, and the quiet authority of the secretary created a space where the ordinary world no longer seemed relevant. The passengers were participants in an unspoken pact of vigilance, respect, and attention to detail. Rhodes scanned the radar one more time, noting the absence of potential threats. Vega mirrored his movements. They didn't speak beyond necessary comms. Their bond required no words. They were there to protect, and every second reinforced their commitment. The fight wasn't glamorous. It was silent, methodical, and exacting. Inside the transport, the passengers remained in awe, aware that they were experiencing something rare and irreplaceable. The flight had become a living demonstration of trust, authority, and unspoken hierarchy. The secretary's mere presence had transformed a routine journey into an event of quiet significance. And outside, the F-35s remained, relentless and precise, guardians of both sky and passenger. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long streaks of gold and amber across the horizon. The transport hummed steadily, gliding over the final stretches of open sky. Passengers had grown accustomed to the rhythm of flight, yet the tension that had dominated earlier hours lingered faintly, like the last note of a deep chord vibrating through the cabin. Outside, the F-35s mirrored the movements of the transport with unwavering precision. Captain Rhodes and Lieutenant Vega adjusted altitudes gently, their formation perfect, wings slicing through sunlight like polished steel. Each adjustment, though subtle, was essential. Their mission had lasted hours, and vigilance could not waver, even as the destination drew near. Inside, the passengers remained quiet, a mixture of anticipation and reflection settling over them. The whispers had long since faded, replaced by a reverent silence. Many stared out the windows at the fading light, tracing the contours of clouds, while others stole glances at the woman in the gray suit. She sat calm, notebook closed, hands folded, eyes focused, but relaxed, a picture of authority and composure. The young lieutenant who had first whispered her identity leaned forward slightly, almost unconsciously. "It's strange," he murmured, "how quiet power feels. Until you realize it's everywhere." His companion nodded, understanding immediately. "She doesn't need to speak. You feel it. It's like gravity. You can't ignore it." The secretary, ever composed, finally allowed herself a faint exhale. She had spent hours reviewing notes, planning, thinking through scenarios that might unfold the moment the aircraft touched down. Her gaze swept across the cabin, meeting those of a few passengers fleetingly, offering quiet acknowledgement without comment. That small gesture carried weight, leaving an impression far deeper than any words could. The pilots outside remained acutely aware of every variable. Rhodes tracked airspeed, wind currents, and any small disturbances that might affect the transport's stability. Vega mirrored his actions with flawless synchronization, their bond forged over countless missions, allowing them to anticipate movements as if sharing a single mind. They were guardians, yes, but also shadow-silent, precise, invisible protectors whose presence reassured more than it intimidated. Minutes stretched as the city lights below began to twinkle faintly against the approaching dusk. The runway was visible now, a thin strip cutting across industrial complexes and suburban roads. Rhodes adjusted altitude slightly, signaling to Vega, whose response was immediate, seamless. Formation remained perfect. They were the silent choreography behind a stage no one would ever see in its entirety. Inside the transport, passengers began preparing for descent. Seat belts clicked into place, belongings stowed, eyes occasionally drifting toward the woman who had remained so composed throughout the journey. The reverence in the cabin was palpable. Everyone recognized, even in the quiet moments before landing, that they had been part of something extraordinary. "Landing in 10 minutes, the co-pilot announced calmly, breaking the silence only enough to signal routine procedure. The cabin adjusted naturally. Yet even as passengers followed protocol, the air retained its quiet intensity. It was not fear or anxiety, it was recognition. Recognition that the flight had been exceptional, a rare convergence of skill, authority, and discipline. Rhodes felt a subtle tension in his shoulders, though his hands remained steady. Every pilot knew the descent was as critical as any engagement. The transport was vulnerable, its engines slowed, its path predictable. Yet their formation was flawless, the F-35s cutting through the air like twin sentinels. No anomaly went unnoticed, no potential threat untracked. Vega's voice broke into the coms, clipped and calm. Wind shear minor. Approach clear. No incoming traffic detected. Rhodes acknowledged silently, eyes sweeping across the horizon, then down to the transport. The runway approached steadily, and the air shifted subtly as the aircraft began its final glide. Precision mattered more than ever. One miscalculation could ripple through the chain of command, through the formation, through the fragile balance of trust built over hours of flight. Inside, the passengers remained mostly silent, their thoughts reflective. The young lieutenant stared at the woman, realizing finally the depth of the responsibility she carried. "She's..." Everywhere at once, he whispered to no one in particular. Even sitting quietly, she commands more presence than an entire team. The colonel near the front nodded slightly, though he spoke not a word. He had known authority before, had briefed under loud, commanding figures, but nothing compared to this quiet force. The secretary's control, her composure, and the subtle acknowledgement of the pilots outside created a kind of gravity that drew everyone in without effort. The transport's wheels touched the runway gently, the slight jolt echoing through the cabin. Engines reversed smoothly, braking mechanisms engaged, and the aircraft slowed gradually along the tarmac. Outside, the F-35s maintained formation, then slowly veered outward, maintaining surveillance even as the transport taxied toward the terminal. Every movement was deliberate, measured, precise. Passengers released breath they didn't realize they had been holding. The tension eased slightly, replaced by awe and relief. They had witnessed more than just a flight. They had witnessed a demonstration of discipline, vigilance, and quiet authority on a scale few would ever experience. The secretary remained composed, standing only after the aircraft came to a complete stop. She collected her belongings, notebook and pen carefully tucked away, and acknowledged the crew and a few passengers with a nod. Her composure never faltered. She did not need to speak loudly. The respect and acknowledgement in the cabin spoke for her. Outside, Rhodes and Vega completed their final maneuvers, ensuring the transport's safety until it had fully stopped. Their mission, hours in the making, concluded flawlessly. There was no applause, no public recognition, just the satisfaction of duty fulfilled, of a promise kept silently, without expectation of acknowledgement. Passengers began disembarking, many stealing quick, respectful glances at the secretary as she left. The young lieutenant lingered momentarily, heart pounding, realizing that the flight would stay with him for the rest of his career. Even the most experienced officers and staffers shared similar quiet reflections. As she walked toward the awaiting convoy, the secretary remained calm, a figure of quiet authority moving through the evening light. The F-35 slowly ascended again, leaving the transport behind, wings cutting the sky like shadows of the mission just completed. Rhodes and Vega exchanged a silent acknowledgement, satisfied, disciplined, invisible guardians fading into the horizon. Back on the tarmac, the passengers and crew exchanged subdued comments. Some spoke of the flight's precision, others of the incredible presence of the secretary. No one tried to diminish what had occurred. It was understood without words. They had been part of something extraordinary, a journey not defined by spectacle, but by discipline, vigilance, and quiet authority. The secretary glanced briefly at the departing passengers, offering a subtle nod of appreciation. She did not need to speak. She did not need to explain. The weight of her presence, the hours of the flight, and the unwavering protection of the pilots outside had communicated everything necessary. The sun dipped fully below the horizon, painting the sky in deep crimson and violet. Shadows stretched across the tarmac. The transport sat quiet, passengers slowly dispersing, carrying with them the memory of a journey unlike any other. Outside, the F-35s disappeared into the fading light, completing a mission that few would ever know, yet one that would remain indelible in the minds of those who had shared the sky. The secretary stepped into the waiting vehicle, calm and composed. The weight of hours spent in silence, observation, and calculation remained with her, but she carried it effortlessly. Her mission had been completed. The passengers' awe, the pilot's discipline, the precise ballet of machinery and human vigilance, all had culminated in this moment. And as the convoy began its journey away from the airfield, the memory of the flight lingered in the minds of those who had been aboard. The quiet authority of one woman, the disciplined guardianship of two pilots, and the recognition that power does not always roar, it often whispers. Observed in awe and understood in reflection.